Every spiritual tradition enjoins us to act with two seemingly opposite yet paradoxically complementary feeling states of compassion and dispassion. The two are psychologically necessary for the sustenance of each other. And we can see this in the mythology of all the world's traditions, but perhaps most graphically in that of the image of the crucifixion, which is followed not immediately by the ascension, but by the harrowing of hell. The crucifixion is the metaphor given in Kali Yuga, especially in the West, but globally, for the destiny of the ego. And the ego will be crucified by life itself, but it must be crucified voluntarily if we are to ascend. That crucifixion, that is the brokenness that life foists upon us, leads to the hell realm. And when we can make use of that brokenness, when we can heal from it, when we can morphose it into compassion for those who are suffering, and for the difficulty of the struggle to ascend and liberate oneself from the ego, then we gain the dispassion that gives us the power to overcome our own brokenness. And as we approach the apocalyptic period, apocalypse meaning revelation, the revelation of truth, what is revealed as every day every ego, becomes more and more tamasic. It more and more reveals its rotten core of weakness, pitifulness, I would even say. And pity is not the same as compassion. But it is that horror of the ego's weakness, its willingness to betray itself, its failure in its own eyes to live up to its own ideals of life and to remain in the company of God through the journey of existence. Forces the revelation of that ultimate understanding of why the ego is what it is and how its own poisonous nature can be turned into medicine. But the detachment from the ego and the structure of the ego's way of perceiving, which is the bonding of subject to object, can only be transcended once one has been willing to let go of all objects, and thus of one's own egoic subjectivity. And so the hell realm becomes composed, at least for a yogi who can have a scientific approach to the analysis of hell, the condition of the tamasic ego, with that compassion that comes of one's own healing from one's own innermost pain that cannot be shared or even known until one has opened up one's aspiration in life to that highest dimension of consciousness and committed oneself to attain liberation. It is in that heroic act alone that one discovers the weakness of the ego. And thus it is indeed the hero's journey, and everyone who is on that journey, regardless of how much they are suffering and how much they are falling time and time again, or how much they are unable to offer their mind and heart to God, or to let go of thought and of worry and of desire and fear. It is through the capacity for compassion, which comes only after having faced one's own ego's inadequacies, that the breaking of the shell of that bond of subject to object becomes possible. And the monadic nature of consciousness at the ego and the soul level both become revealed. And the medicine that is available at the shamanic level, the soul level of knowledge of this dynamic of the ego's own self-hatred and the projection of that as a lack of compassion and a detachment only from one's heart, but not from one's ego, brings one to a forced bending of the knee to that need for grace that can only be felt in the dark night of the soul, and thus why such a passage becomes necessary. The ego's essential problem is its inability to stop grasping for objects. It will claim them as objects of love or objects that it wants to rescue or heal, but it is always an abject need for that object, out of one's own fear of insecurity and lack of visible means of support. And even if one breaks through that level, there is the unwillingness to give up the mental means of support produced by a constant flood of language, producing mental objects that keep one from having to feel the emptiness and the lack of any support except that of God. But the ego cannot take the support of God directly. And thus, the breaking of the ego's hubris, its arrogance, its belief that it can run away from itself and depend upon its objects, must itself be broken as a fictional method of constructing a life that will not hold when the storms of Maya begin. Now, the prayers to God are all prayers, as you may have noticed, to the one who is Avinashi, indestructible. And indeed, the real self is completely safe from Maya. Maya cannot lay a glove on it. But once one agrees to leave the transcendent self and enter the phenomenal ring, the fight club that is egoic life, and one puts on the fighting uniform of language as one's weapon, as one's defense, as one's means of control, then to silence the mind in order to open that space for the reception of the presence of God becomes dangerous, and becomes for the cynical, tamasic ego an impossibility, because it cannot believe in God. It cannot have faith. It is impossible for it to tolerate the emptiness in that gap before the fullness of God arrives to fill one's lack. And the terror of emotional implosion, the terror of destabilization, in which one will no longer be able to manage life, in which one's knees will go weak and one will not be able to stand or walk or face the other, or face oneself, or face one's mind, the hell realm that one's own mind can easily become, that one uses one's objects in order to avoid. And thus one discovers that the very method of protecting oneself from agony is the cause of one's agony. Because the holding on to those objects of desire, of security, of sadomasochistic interrelationality, of crazing, making, assuaging and soothing, of the dread of the ego's loss, of all means of supporting itself, leads to that recognition of one's abasement, that itself becomes an intolerable recognition. And thus a catch-22 ensues, in which one cannot get out of the hell realm, because it means realizing that the nature of the hell realm is oneself. And one must escape one's own mind. But the mind cannot be escaped without that love, the forcible opening of the heart to God, in that moment when only grace will be of any avail, because there are no more resources within the ego or within its grasp of any objects to be able to enable it to cross the chasm that it faces in dealing with its own terror of aliveness, of aloneness, of existence itself. And it is overcome by its lack of any sense of who it is, or of what it can do, or of where it must go. It is the totality of the lostness of the consciousness at that moment of truth that is the proof of the greatness of the spiritual warrior, who has the power of that humility that knows only in its own sacrifice can it find that core of undefiled consciousness that will enable an ascension of its mind from its own hell realm into a state of peace, a state of freedom from unbearable terrors, beyond anything that could be called a mere worry or a fear, but a dread that is nameless, unspeakable, unendurable, that most would like to think is only something that other people will have to deal with, and that one can put off one's need to gain the power to face and overcome that darkness which lies not within an outer night, but in the innermost core of the constant presence of the shadow that would destroy one's peace and one's ordered life in a way that would shatter one's ability even to pick up the pieces. It is this that the world itself is facing, and every ego as a microcosm is facing. And if one gives in to the belief that one can run away from all of this into some chakra 2 fantasy, one will soon find that that just increases the devastation and the sense of self-betrayal and failure and delusory projection of its own self upon a mannequin that can offer no support in the time of greatest need. And thus it is only that final surrender of all that one is and all that one has to the only source of peace that is, that will bring everyone, whether a yogi or a bogey, back to God in that time when only God remains as the final hope for salvation. An ashram must function as a place where someone can come and find that strength, not by clinging on to other objects, but by being helped to go deeper within than the ego itself in its monstrous mental self-attacking objects can reach, and enter into that ascension of consciousness to its supreme abode, to that supreme peace that cannot be touched by the mind or by the world or by any others. For in that state and in that state alone, otherness itself, the final illusion, is conquered. Otherness that is external and otherness that is internal. Otherness that is immanent and otherness that is transcendent. That ultimate unification with God that dissolves suffering must be attained before one's little boat goes over the waterfall at the end of Kali Yuga. And there is no longer any bank to hold on to, or any banker to give you any currency to survive the collapse and the bankruptcy of consciousness, and the rocks that lie in wait below to tear apart the consciousness that has not already surrendered itself to the Absolute. And as we approach that moment of ultimate truth, may we all be prepared. May we all be ready to offer those ropes of salvation to those going past over the cliff, for that final hope of salvation must be offered by a merciful God. And if we have the capacity to grasp it, and then the compassion to offer it to others, and the dispassion not to be yanked into that same stream by the other, then alone will we be able to carry out the mission which God has assigned us, which is to be fulfilled in the very near future. May we have the courage, the wisdom, the perseverance, the strength, the love, the devotion to God that will be required.